And joining us now, our panelist. Colin Reed is the chair of the Economics and Finance Department at SUNY Plattsburgh. He is a Clinton County legislator and a columnist with the Press Republican. And Jay Bryan is the recently retired business and economics columnist with the Montreal Gazette, enjoying his retirement. All right, up top, Congress voted a couple of weeks ago to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank. We had talked about this last month. It looks like it's won a reprieve for about 9 months, but it is still coming under heavy criticism by Tea Party Republicans, small government conservatives on Capitol Hill who want to see it go. And we hear from Bill Owens, we heard a little bit earlier from Congressman Owens, that he believes it's vital to a number of businesses. There are manufacturers here in the North Country that say 30 to 50% of their workforce comes from exports that are financed by the Export-Import Bank.
I'm just wondering how Congress, if they ever do manage to kill the Import-Export Bank, will manage to kill Canada's Export Development Bank and all of the other export-encouraging banks all over the world that are financing exports from the competitors of American companies. I haven't heard much about that.
That really would be problematic to, import-export is complicated, and all the letters of credit and all the things that need to line up just right to make the transaction go through.
So it's more than loans. It's loans, loan guarantees, insurance. It's a number of things to help the transactions happen.
That's right. It's quite significant. And as Jay alluded, the Europeans are geniuses at this. And if you're say an airline in South America that's looking to purchase Airbuses versus Boeing, we were just talking just before the show, you may now be encouraged to buy Airbuses because of all the facilitation, everything else being equal. Now, it's not going to hurt the average small business. The average small business is a little bit less sophisticated to probably access this, but some of the medium to large businesses really rely on it.
Although I imagine, I don't know enough about the Export-Import Bank, but I know that its Canadian equivalent does have something of a focus on small business, because managing the complications and the risks involved in export trade and getting paid for what you've sold can be pretty overwhelming for a medium-sized company with a couple hundred employees and just beginning to dip its toes in that kind of market. And these guys do some very good work in helping to guide people through the process and giving them tools to ensure that they're not taking as big a risk as they might otherwise take.
Some of the critics say that while it does help small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, the overwhelming majority that use it are large corporations, and that's one of the criticisms, that Boeing is one that gets billions every year from.
Would that have something to do with the fact that the overwhelming majority of exports come from large businesses, and the overwhelming majority of aircraft exports come from Boeing? Just there could be something to that.
Absolutely. Also, the argument private lenders can do just as good a job.
They're not going to do all the facilitation, though. That's really a specialized skill. I think you can facilitate just the financial transactions, the letters of credit, and all that kind of stuff. But that whole mechanism to pave the way, and what would, to me, would just be overwhelmingly complicated, I think, is a valuable service that I just don't see a private entity coming in now. That we might be able to create an industry of specialized agents that help facilitate that. Indeed, we do. We have brokerage houses and these sorts of things as well. But if other countries are kind of giving this away and we're the ones that are going to charge for it, it puts our companies a little bit of a competitive disadvantage.
And supporters, of course, will say that this doesn't cost the government money. It makes the government billions a year, about $3.5 billion a year that it brings into the Treasury.
I believe the same thing is true in Canada and probably in other countries too. It's not as if it's a huge drain on the public purse.
It seems all but certain in June it'll be scrutinized and voted on separately. Many people say that will probably be the end of it, that the days will be numbered. It passed a few weeks ago. The deadline that was looming was earlier this week because it was part of a continuing resolution that funded the government and avoided the threat of another government shutdown, and also included money to arm rebels in Syria. So that's why there was no challenge to it this time around. But Tea Party Republicans say that come June, it's going to get its day.
Well, hopefully cooler heads will prevail. We did have a congressman that does understand import-export, having really cut his teeth on a lot of the cross-border issues in this area. So we just can hope that we have good advocates for this continuing going forward.
The Clinton Community College has received news that it has been awarded a grant, a New York SUNY 2020 grant it's called, state money, more than $12.5 million, about 12.7, to construct an advanced manufacturing institute on its campus. It looks like construction, once they get a year of planning under their belt, will get underway in 2015 and hopefully open by 2016. There has been talk about the need for a tech center like this to basically train the workers of tomorrow that the manufacturers here in the area need.
I think not a tech center, but we would really literally need thousands of these sorts of centers all across the country just to meet the workforce demand. I think I saw a figure in North Country alone, there's thousands of jobs that go unfilled just because of a mismatch between the skills in the workforce and the skills that companies now need. You know, every company is becoming technologically much more sophisticated in manufacturing, and you need advanced training beyond high school to figure out the CAD CAM and all the various instrumentation that is standard at a cheese manufacturer or
Garment maker.
Yeah, even Jefford Steel in town here has incredibly advanced equipment to do all the laser cutting for the steel work and all the drilling. Things just aren't done manually anymore, and you need an awful lot of expertise, and it's difficult for these companies to take on all that training themselves. I think this is absolute coup for Clinton Community College and going to bode well.
Yeah, I agree. High tech used to be the sort of thought of as the domain of computer companies and biotechnology companies, but actually it's the domain of just about any company that is successful, especially if it's successful across state borders or provincial borders or international borders. And community colleges, which for a long time didn't get much respect, have been punching above their weight for a long time in giving people the essential skills they need to get jobs that by and large are good jobs with very significant skills. I hope we see a whole lot more initiatives like this one in Plattsburgh.
And not only Clinton Community College and this tech center, we also see this year, this fall, the first program here in the area, the P-Tech program based at Peru High School. This is the concept of the 6-year high school, where you go to high school for 4 years, then you have 2 years of college, get your associate's degree, and you get intense high-tech training so that you're ready for manufacturing jobs and engineering jobs and such when you come out of school.
I think it's the connect that's been missing for so long. There's been really a disconnect between K through 12, community colleges, then even on to 4-year colleges. They each operate in a silo, but we have to really start connecting the dots much more effectively on behalf of our kids. You know, a 16, 17, 18-year-old really has their mind elsewhere and not quite thinking about what the best occupation might be, and if we can somehow encourage them and incentivize them, steer them, and have our act together so we can give them that pathway and show them mentoring and lead them to people who are actually successful in these careers, I think we do a service. But it's going to require, guidance counselors in high school to actually talk to people in the community college who actually need to talk to people in the 4-year colleges, and those communications lines are only now being resurrected again.
That's one of the reasons I think that community colleges have been punching above their weight, because they didn't have the kind of somewhat reserved attitude toward the gritty business of helping people get jobs. They didn't think of themselves as places that were turning out philosopher kings who would be running the country someday, the way a lot of elite universities do. They were very happy to talk to employers and set up a special program, if need be, to serve a particular local manufacturer. We have that with an aerospace-oriented, essentially community college in the Montreal area. They call them CEGEPs there, and they start 1 year earlier, but it's basically the same idea. It's worked very, very well. And there are other initiatives that you could point to all over North America where the community colleges work hand in glove with the local business community, and the community college makes the final decision on what programs they're going to put in, but they're very sensitive to the needs of the local economy.
And speaking of manufacturing in Montreal, we've talked the past few programs about tough news for Bombardier and their aerospace division. in recent weeks, there's been some good news.
A very, very big turnaround in the atmosphere. It's not really, I guess, a fundamental change in the sense that the aircraft we're talking about, their new C-Series aircraft, which is the biggest aircraft they've ever built. It's the first one that really would compete head-to-head with aircraft from the smaller ones from Boeing and Airbus. And it's had a bad run, as you suggested. They lost, or at least they look like they're going to lose, the biggest order that they've ever received for that aircraft from Republic Airways, because Republic is changing its strategy, not because they don't like the C-Series, but because they're going to be more oriented toward commuter routes that don't need such a big aircraft. And they had an engine fail during a test, failed pretty disastrously, and it began to look as if, gee, the program's already been delayed. That's true with just about every new aircraft because they're so complex, but still, it was a huge shot on the arm when we just discovered this past week that they've got an order that's even bigger than the biggest order they had previously. It's an order for 40 aircraft and options for 10 more from Macquarie, which is a respected aircraft leasing company. And the big thing about that is not just that it's a really large order coming at a time when their fortunes seem to be at a low ebb, but it's an order from the kind of customer, it's not an order from an airline, but from the kind of customer that passes the aircraft on to all kinds of other customers. Essentially, leasing outfits like Macquarie work for the airlines, find the aircraft that they think are likely to be the most popular among airlines, and then they lock up orders for a whole bunch of them. So it looks like this is kind of a harbinger of probably more demand that's out there and will materialize.
And that's good. And they're still probably looking at the end of next year before they start delivering the first of the planes. The Pratt & Whitney engine problem, they're still trying to work through that.
They're working through that. They say they have a fix, and yeah, 2015 is what we're looking at now, and I probably wouldn't bet my firstborn on any particular delivery date because, you know, the Dreamliner from Boeing, which is a fabulous aircraft, had all kinds of delays. The 380, the giant aircraft from Airbus, their last big initiative, all kinds of delays. Aircraft are just so amazingly complicated when you get into these kinds of large ones that it always takes longer than you think.
Bombardier Aerospace, based in Montreal, one of the biggest employers in the region?
Yeah, a very big employer. That's right. And the aerospace industry in general is a very big employer. And of course, Bombardier feeds a whole lot of other aerospace companies because they need landing gear for their aircraft. They need specialized aluminum alloys for their aircraft. They need the engines, the Pratt & Whitney engines, and so forth and so on.
That's encouraging news. It comes at a time when
Tremendous,
obviously Quebec is dealing with all sorts of financial issues. As we've talked here, they certainly are deep in the red. The new government is trying to figure out how to make cuts to make up more than a $2 billion deficit.
Yeah, the Quebec government has been in financial crisis for as long as I can remember. I mean, literally going back decades. And you know, they have good years when the crisis seems to abate for a while, but even when that sort of thing happens, you look back and you find out after a few years that some of it was financial wizardry rather than actual improvement in the situation. But they have a government in place now whose finance minister, Carlos Leitao, and whose premier seem to be fairly solid people who are not trying to do flashy things that'll make everything look better overnight. So even though I'm a little worried, I do think that they're probably trying to lay into place a series of reforms that will have a long-term effect in bending the curve toward a balanced budget in Quebec, which of course we do very much need.
Layoffs a big part of it though, and is that the fear that inevitably, especially say in the healthcare field, that there will be layoffs?
I don't think so. Strong compression on hiring, certainly. And I mean, that's just something that we need to have because Quebec has had the reputation, deservedly so, for decades of being a province where you'll have pretty much the same service as you have in other provinces, but the number of government employees per 100,000 population is a lot higher. And it's kind of hard to figure out. We just have this form of government bureaucracy that seems to have more layers than maybe it really needs to have.
And the first things that come to mind are healthcare, education. Are there any areas that will see greater cuts than the other?
I don't think so because those are the areas that are the hardest to cut because nobody wants to admit that they're slashing the heart out of the education system or out of the healthcare system, but those are the two areas that together account for most of the government's budget. So really all they can do is compress like crazy, try to hold costs down. Maybe if they do really well, they'll bring about some actual reforms in the structure of both education and healthcare, which could save them quite a lot of money, but I'm not holding my breath.
The recovery here at home, churning right along. The numbers looking pretty good for the second quarter for the GDP, personal spending up, and so things looking good. But you mentioned that with the recovery, there are some interesting signs, interesting side notes.
That's right, and knock on wood, it does seem like the U.S. is faring quite a bit better than our European colleagues, but during the recession, especially a deep recession like this, student enrollment in higher education goes shooting right up because, of course, the opportunity cost, what you're sacrificing to have to go to school is so much lower if you know you're going to be unemployed or go to school. But now we see quite a steep decline in student enrollment, and this is something we see during recessions, but this is quite a bit more pronounced. We've lost almost 1 million students in higher education this upcoming year, so that's significant. And community colleges, we were talking about community colleges and their good fortune a little bit earlier. Community colleges actually feel that effect 3 or 4 times more intensely than the four-year colleges, which themselves are hurting. So
we know enrollment has been down at Clinton Community College, and that forced them to look at some cuts and the elimination of some positions there. Paul Smith's also seeing a decline in enrollment over the past year.
That's right, and SUNY Plattsburgh is working harder than ever to try to keep those student numbers up, and we're recognizing it's more and more of a challenge. So this may be a rough few years when you have growth of 3, 4, 5%. This is not at all uncommon that we see this plunge. The other funny thing that we see is family formation following a deep recession plunges quite a bit as well. Especially the theory is that males with fewer job prospects during a deep recession, they usually are hit harder than females, are just unwilling to have families or unable to have families. So we see the rate of family formation drop as well.
So now they're seeing that 5, 6, 7 years out.
Right, which will have a little bit of a dip for college populations in another 18 or 20 years. So,
but to give
it's complex.
Credit where credit is due, the United States, I think, deserves a great deal of credit, despite the nightmarish mess of hyper-partisanship in Washington over the last few years. The dose of stimulus that was injected into the economy early on in the Obama administration, largely thanks to the fact that it could be done under the cover of the Bush administration, has made a huge amount of difference. That really is the difference between a United States that has had a few rough years but never really went into a second recession and is now getting up to rates of growth that are fairly impressive. Second quarter just surprised us a lot, 4.6% growth. That's, we're not going to see that for the whole year, but that's a very, very strong pace of growth. In Europe, they're talking about maybe a second recession or a third recession in some countries, and the difference is the United States followed the old traditional Keynesian fiscal playbook and put a jolt of government money into the economy when it was on its knees. And the Europeans believed in the austerity mantra, and they tried to bleed the patient while it was practically on its deathbed. And I think we can see which one worked better. Now we're seeing that the federal deficit in the United States is down in the neighborhood of $50 billion this year, which is a fraction of what it was just a couple of years ago. The federal deficit in Canada, thanks largely to the fact that the United States is recovering, because the U.S. is obviously the locomotive for the whole Western Hemisphere, is even lower. It's 16 billion, which on a proportionate basis is, something like maybe half or a third what the American one is, and maybe Canada will be looking at a surplus in another year or two. All of that is because there has been much, much better economic management in the United States, despite all of the difficulties. And I can look forward and see some hope, even for public education in the United States, which has been savaged by huge tuition increases in public universities across the country, the pride of the American education system. Maybe that'll back off a little bit because the federal fiscal improvement is being mirrored in big improvements in a lot of states. Perhaps we'll see education coming back to a place where it's available to just about everybody, instead of following the trajectory it's on right now, where it becomes increasingly unaffordable.
Will we, with the robust second quarter, hear more calls for the Fed to consider raising interest rates?
Oh, of course, you've heard constant calls for that ever since we were in the depths of the recession. People have been saying that they were going to cause hyperinflation, and the dollar would be worth half a peso, and all the rest of it. And we're going to keep on hearing it. And I imagine the Fed is actually going to start listening, but maybe not right away. Probably not this year, maybe sometime next year. But I hope they're going to be very cautious. I don't like low interest rates. I'm a retiree. Low interest rates are brutal to retirees. But if your choice is higher interest rates and a little bit more money in your savings account or from your savings account, along with an economy that stumbles back into a recession, no thanks, I'll take the low interest rates.
That's right. Mr. Retiree, now you have a different perspective on a number of things.
I'm officially a codger, that's right.
Still more talk this week. We talked about this last month about the bubble, and it's still within the past few days. This discussion continues about the stock market and the bubble. Stock market having a few rough days, rough go of it the past couple of weeks.
Another point of view that I saw recently from a guy named Peter Berezin, who runs the Bank Credit Analyst publication out of Montreal, is that there's no particular need for us to have either a continued expansion of what probably is pretty close to a bubble, or a big crash. I mean, those are just the two dramatic things that could happen, but looking back through history, he's got a bunch of charts that seem to suggest that there have been many, many periods in the past where the stock market has hit a peak and then maybe had a crash and maybe not had a crash, but has basically just bubbled along without a heck of a lot of change year to year in most years for another 20 years or so before surpassing the previous peak. So his suggestion is that quite a likely scenario is that we just won't see much of anything in the stock market, and it could be for as long as a couple of decades. It wouldn't be a wonderful scenario, but you wouldn't lose your shirt, and if you were invested conservatively in stocks that pay dividends, you might be okay. And if you wanted to make a little more money in the stock market, then you go offshore to countries that have a faster growth rate than the United States. Now, all of this is predicated on the assumption that the United States has got maybe not a permanently slower growth rate than we had in the last few decades, but at least a slower growth rate for quite a while to come. I don't know if that's true, but a lot of very smart people think it is.
Some of the news of the week is eBay spinning off PayPal, and a lot of analysts having fun with that, trying to figure out who may be interested in PayPal. And a couple of the names being floated around include Google and Alibaba.
It's sort of hard to figure out because one of the reasons that it is said that it made sense for eBay to spin off PayPal, which after all is not such a huge stretch to have a company that sells things and to have a payment system. It's not like they were involved in nuclear technology and soft serve ice cream or something. It's not like they were really dividing management's attention, even though Carl Icahn, the guy who sparked this, seems to say that every time he buys a stake in a company and tries to split it up. But one of the reasons it maybe did make sense for them to sell off PayPal is that a company that sells stuff in competition with eBay is hardly going to want to use eBay's own payment system in order to handle its sales. So that sort of cuts PayPal out of Amazon and a whole bunch of other big, and maybe out of Alibaba. So if Alibaba bought PayPal, how would they avoid having the same curse? I can't figure that out. It's just too complicated for me.
And you mentioned Carl Icahn. Of course, he has been pushing for this deal to happen, and he had quite a nice payday this week when it was announced, $180 million payday. So.
Yep, not a bad day.
All right. Well, on that note, that is going to do it for this month. We want to let you know that you can watch our Business Roundtable online at Mountain Lake Journal, and you can watch that anytime and see these gentlemen once again. That is our business edition for this month. We want to thank Colin and Jay, and thank you for watching. For all of us here at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Hellick. We'll see you next time.